The sledgehammer crashed into the concrete as sirens wailed in the distance. Karen stood at her fence, phone trembling in her hand, screaming about property destruction and neighborhood values. But when the police arrived and saw what was really buried beneath that pool, when they understood why Marcus had torn it down in the middle of the night, everything changed. The woman who'd called 911 to stop him was about to learn that some secrets are worth breaking concrete for. The pool had been Marcus Rivera's prison for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not the chlorinated water that reflected the California sun, or the perfectly manicured deck where his neighbors sipped their morning coffee. The prison was the memory that lived beneath the reason he couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe, couldn't look at his reflection in that cursed water without seeing Daniel's face staring back. "You sure about this, man?" Tony Hernandez hefted the sledgehammer, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the pre-dawn chill. "Karen's gonna lose her mind." Marcus glanced toward the imposing Tudor house next door, where Karen Witt's bedroom window overlooked his backyard like a watchtower. The woman had made his life hell since the day he'd moved into this upscale riverside neighborhood. Complaints about his music, his guests, his urban landscaping choices, but this wasn't about Karen's delicate sensibilities. "She can lose whatever she wants," Marcus said, pulling on work gloves. "I should have done this years ago." The pool stretched before them, an Olympic-sized monument to his former life. When he'd bought the house, fresh off his settlement from the LAPD, the realtor had gushed about the resort-style amenities and entertainer's dream backyard. What she hadn't mentioned was that some dreams turn into nightmares when you close your eyes. Tony positioned himself at the shallow end, where decorative tilework spelled out Rivera in elegant script. Marcus's ex-wife, Sophia, had insisted on that detail, back when she still believed they could build something beautiful together. Before Daniel, before everything fell apart. "Last chance to call this off," Tony said, but his grip on the hammer was firm. He'd been Marcus's partner for 8 years on the force. He knew why they were here. Marcus nodded toward the house across the street, where old Mr. Chen was already up, tending to his roses in the pre-dawn light. The man worked every morning at 5 a.m., methodical and precise. He'd never complained about Marcus, never called the HOA, never made him feel like an intruder. In his own neighborhood, do it. The first blow echoed like thunder across the subdivision. Concrete cracked, sending spiderwebs through the pristine surface. Birds erupted from nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began barking. A light flickered on. In Karen's bedroom window, Marcus grabbed his own hammer and attacked the deep end, each strike a release of pressure that had been building for over 3 years. Chunks of concrete flew, revealing the dark earth beneath. The sound was violent, cathartic, necessary. "Hey, Karen's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. She appeared at her back door in a silk bathrobe, her perfectly styled blonde hair wild with sleep and rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus didn't stop swinging, couldn't stop. The rhythm was hypnotic, meditative. Crack, chunk, crack, chunk. Each piece of broken concrete was another day of grief, another night of insomnia, another memory he could finally bury properly. "I'm talking to you, Rivera." Karen stormed across her manicured lawn to the chain-link fence that separated their properties. She'd spent 2 years trying to get the HOA to force him to replace it with something more aesthetically pleasing. "You can't just destroy property like this. There are noise ordinances, permits required." Tony paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's his pool, lady, on his property, not at 5 in the morning." Karen's voice pitched higher, carrying across the sleeping neighborhood. Lights were beginning to flicker on in windows. "Johnson's, the Patels, the Martinez family. This is a residential area. There are children trying to sleep." Marcus finally stopped, his chest heaving. He turned to face Karen, and for a moment, the hate in her eyes faltered. Because whatever she saw in his face, the raw grief, the desperate need, the weight of secrets too heavy to carry, made her take a step back. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough with dust and emotion, "I lost my son in this pool 3 years ago. I should have filled it in the day after the funeral, but I couldn't. I couldn't face it. I'm facing it now." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For a heartbeat, Marcus thought he saw something human flicker across her features. Surprise, maybe even sympathy. But then her jaw hardened, and the moment passed. "That's terrible," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "But personal tragedies don't give you the right to violate city codes. I'm calling the police." She spun on her heel and marched back toward her house, bathrobe billowing like a war banner. Marcus watched her go, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise, he'd stopped expecting humanity from Karen Whitmore long ago, but something else, a kind of grim anticipation. "Bitch," Tony muttered, raising his hammer again. "Let her call, we're not doing anything illegal." But Marcus held up a hand, stopping him, because Karen didn't know the whole truth about Daniel's death. None of them did. The police report listed it as an accidental drowning, a tragic case of a 4-year-old boy who'd somehow gotten past multiple safety barriers on a Sunday afternoon. While his parents were inside arguing about divorce papers, the official story was neat, clean, legally airtight. It had allowed Marcus to collect on Daniel's life insurance policy, to receive the sympathy of his neighbors, to grieve as a victim of cruel circumstance rather than Marcus. Tony's voice seemed to come from far away. "You okay, man?" Marcus blinked, returning to the present. The sledgehammer felt impossibly heavy in his hands, weighted with more than steel. Yeah, let's keep going." They worked in relative silence after that, the rhythm of destruction punctuated only by the distant sound of Karen's voice on the phone, probably giving some poor dispatcher an earful about property destruction and public disturbances. Other neighbors had emerged, some curious, some annoyed, all keeping their distance. By 6 a.m., they'd broken through nearly a quarter of the pool's concrete shell. Marcus's back ached, his hands were blistered despite the gloves, and sweat stung his eyes, but for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he could breathe. That's when he saw the car. A black BMW sedan, parked at the end of his driveway with the engine running. Tinted windows, clean lines, the kind of car that screamed law enforcement. Even without the telltale antennas, Marcus's blood turned to ice water. "Tony," he said quietly. His former partner looked up from the section of concrete he'd been attacking, followed Marcus's gaze to the sedan, and went very still. They both recognized the car. More specifically, they recognized who drove cars like that. Internal affairs. The driver's door opened and Detective Sandra Chen stepped out, no relation to the elderly man across the street, despite sharing a surname. She was young, ambitious, and had made her reputation taking down dirty cops. She wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly mortgage payment, and her expression was as cold as winter fog. "Detective Rivera," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the morning air. "Interesting morning project you've got there." Marcus set down his sledgehammer and walked toward the fence, very aware that Karen was now standing at her kitchen window, cell phone still pressed to her ear, watching the scene unfold with obvious satisfaction. "It's just Marcus now," he said. "I retired, remember? I remember a lot of things." Detective Chen approached the fence, her heels clicking on the concrete driveway. "I remember a case that got closed awfully quick. A little boy's death that raised some interesting questions." Tony moved to stand beside Marcus, and the two former partners exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They'd worked together long enough to communicate without words, and right now, the message was clear. "We're in trouble." Questions that were answered. Marcus said carefully. "The investigation was thorough. Accidental drowning. Home." Detective Chen pulled out a tablet, swiped through several screens. "Accidental drowning. 4-year-old Daniel Rivera. Sunday afternoon, March 15th, 2021. Parents inside the house, arguing about custody arrangements. Child somehow bypassed pool gate, safety cover, and multiple alarms. Found floating face down 20 minutes later." Each word hit Marcus like a physical blow-up. He could see that day so clearly Sophia screaming at him about the divorce papers, about taking Daniel to Portland with her new boyfriend, about how Marcus's job was turning him into someone she didn't recognize. He could remember storming out to the pool deck to cool off, remember looking at the water and thinking about how peaceful it looked, how easy it would be to just case closed remarkably fast. Detective Chen continued. "No charges filed. Insurance claim paid out in full. Very neat and tidy." "What's your point?" Tony asked, but his voice lacked its usual edge. Detective Chen smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "My point is that I've been reviewing old cases, looking for patterns, loose ends, and this one." She tapped her tablet. "This one has always bothered me." The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. Marcus Rever, former detective, grieving father, child killer, stood in his backyard surrounded by the broken concrete of his son's grave, while Detective Chen read him his rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. ... Double quotes, but Marcus wasn't listening to the Miranda warning. He was watching the crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk, beyond his property line. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, clutching her coffee mug like a lifeline. The teenage Martinez boy, recording everything on his phone with the casual cruelty of his generation. Mr. Chen, still holding his gardening shears, his weathered face a mask of quiet judgment. And Karen Whitmore, standing at her fence like a queen surveying her conquered territory, that damning recording still glowing on her phone screen. "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Detective Chen finished. Marcus nodded, his voice trapped somewhere between his chest and his throat. 3 years of carefully constructed lies, 3 years of playing the grieving father, 3 years of letting people bring him casseroles and pat his shoulder and tell him that God had a plan, all of it crumbling because he'd finally tried to do the right thing. The worst part, he'd almost gotten away with it. If he'd just left the pool alone, kept living with the nightmares and the guilt and the weight of Daniel's ghost pressing down on him every night, no one would have ever known the truth. But Karen couldn't let him tear down his own goddamn pool. In peace. "Detective Chen," Tony stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I need to make something clear. I had no knowledge of any, save it Hernandez. Detective Chen guided Marcus toward the gate, her grip firm but not unnecessarily rough. And we'll be talking to you plenty. Right now, I need to secure this scene and get our suspect processed. Tony flinched at the word suspect, and Marcus felt a stab of guilt that cut even deeper than his shame. His former partner had come here, as a friend had brought a sledgehammer to help him find peace, and now Tony's career was probably over too. The LAPD didn't look kindly on officers who helped cover up child murders, even unwittingly. I didn't know, Tony called after them, his voice cracking. Marcus, you have to tell them I didn't know. But Marcus couldn't find words. What was there to say? That Tony was innocent? That would be true, but irrelevant guilt by association was still guilt in the eyes of internal affairs. That he was sorry? Sorry didn't bring back Daniel. Sorry didn't undo 3 years of lies. Sorry was just another word that died in the throat. As they reached the driveway, Karen intercepted them, practically vibrating with excitement. Detective, I want to make sure you have everything you need for my recording. I can email it to you, or transfer it to a secure ma'am. Detective Chen's voice was patient but firm. Please step back. This is now a crime scene. Of course. But Karen didn't step back. Instead, she moved closer, her eyes bright with malicious satisfaction. I just want you to know that I've been suspicious of him for years. The way he acted after the boy died never seemed right. Too controlled, you know? Like he was performing grief instead of feeling it. Marcus stopped walking, and Detective Chen had to tug gently on his arm to keep him moving. Because Karen was right, and that was the thing that made it unbearable. She'd seen through him when trained investigators hadn't. She'd recognized the hollow performance of his morning when his own wife had been fooled. And the insurance money, Karen continued, falling into step beside them like an overeager prosecutor. $250,000, paid out in full just 6 months after the death. Most insurance companies drag their feet on accidental death claims, especially when children are involved. But this one went through like clockwork. Detective Chen glanced at Marcus, and he saw the question in her eyes. Because Karen was right about that too. The insurance payout had been suspiciously smooth, processed without the usual delays in investigations. At the time, Marcus had been grateful for the money it had allowed him to quit the force, to buy this house, to build the life he thought he deserved. Now he realized it had probably been a red flag to anyone paying attention. How do you know about the insurance? Detective Chen asked. Karen's smile turned predatory. I make it my business to know about my neighbors. Property values, you understand. When someone moves into a neighborhood like this, you want to make sure they suitable. The racism was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in the language of property values and community standards. Marcus had heard it before, in a dozen different ways, from a dozen different Karens, over the years. The suggestion that he didn't belong here, that his presence somehow diminished the neighborhood's carefully maintained veneer of respectability. What Karen didn't realize was that she was absolutely right. A child killer didn't belong in any neighborhood, no matter how much money he'd paid for the privilege. They reached the black BMW, and Detective Chen opened the rear door. The interior smelled like leather and disappointment, and Marcus realized this was probably the last car ride he'd take as a free man. In a few hours, he'd be in county lockup, wearing orange jumpsuit and plastic sandals, trying to figure out how to survive in a place where child killers ranked somewhere below pedophiles on the social hierarchy. Watch your head, Detective Chen said, guiding him into the back seat. As the door slammed shut, Marcus caught a glimpse of Karen through the tinted window. She was talking animatedly to the growing crowd of neighbors, gesturing toward his house, playing the role of heroic whistleblower to the hilt. In her mind, she'd probably already cast herself as the star of this tragedy, the vigilant neighbor who'd brought a killer to justice through her persistence and civic duty. The truth was uglier and more random. Karen hadn't exposed him through brilliant detective work or moral outrage. She'd stumbled into justice the same way she stumbled into everything else. Through petty spite and an inability to mind her own business. Detective Chen slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. You want to tell me about it? Marcus stared out the window at his house, at the broken pool, at the life he was leaving behind. Nothing to tell. You heard the recording. I heard you admit to putting your son in the pool. What I didn't hear was why. The car pulled away from the curb, and Marcus watched his neighborhood shrink in the rearview mirror. Karen was still holding court on the sidewalk, probably already planning her interviews with the local news stations. This story would make her famous in the way that suburban tragedies sometimes did. The observant neighbor who'd seen what others missed, who'd refused to let a killer hide in plain sight. Does it matter? Marcus asked. It matters to the DA, it matters to your lawyer, it might matter to a jury. Marcus closed his eyes. And for a moment he wasn't in the back of a police car but standing on his pool deck 3 years ago, watching Daniel splash in the shallow end while Sophia screamed at him from the kitchen doorway. The custody papers spread across the breakfast table like a declaration of war. The realization that he was about to lose everything: his son, his marriage, his reason for living. She was going to take him away, he said quietly. My ex, she had a new boyfriend in Portland. a tech exec with money and stability and all the things I couldn't give her. The custody agreement would have given me weekends, maybe 2 days out of every 14. Detective Chen navigated through traffic with practiced ease, but Marcus could see her eyes in the rearview mirror, watching his face, cataloging every expression. So you killed him instead? The bluntness of the question hit like a physical blow, because that was what he'd done. Faced with the prospect of sharing custody, he'd chosen to eliminate the problem entirely. Better a dead son than a stolen one. Better to be a grieving widower than a weekend father. I didn't plan it, Marcus said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew how pathetic they sounded. I was angry, and I wanted her to hurt the way she was hurting me. So you drowned your 4-year-old son? Marcus flinched. I held him under until he stopped moving. 30 seconds, maybe 40. He didn't struggle much. He trusted me. The admission hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Detective Chen's grip tightened on the steering wheel, and Marcus realized she was probably a parent herself. Probably had a son or daughter Daniel's age. Probably couldn't imagine the kind of monster who would. Jesus Christ, she whispered. They drove in silence after that, through suburban streets that looked exactly like the one Marcus had just left. Manicured lawns, and 2-car garages, and the illusion of safety that money could buy. Behind those perfect facades, Marcus knew, were 1,000 small tragedies and everyday marriages dissolving, children being damaged, dreams turning into disappointments. But most people found ways to cope that didn't involve murdering their own children. The county jail appeared ahead of them, a concrete fortress that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd given up on the concept of human redemption. Marcus had brought suspects here dozens of times during his years on the force. Had walked through those doors with the casual confidence of someone on the right side of the law. Now he was about to discover what those doors looked like from the outside. 3 months later, Karen Whitmore sat in the witness box of Superior Court, wearing her best Navy suit and the expression of someone who'd found her life's purpose. The courtroom was packed reporters, true crime podcasts hosts, neighbors who'd never spoken to Marcus but felt entitled to witness his downfall. Karen basked in the attention like a sunflower turning toward light. Mrs. Whitmore, District Attorney Patricia Valdez, approached the witness stand with the measured stride of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times. Can you tell the jury about your observations of the defendant's behavior following his son's death? Karen straightened in her chair, savoring the moment. She'd been preparing for this testimony for weeks, rehearsing her responses, perfecting her delivery. This was her vindication, her proof that she'd been right about Marcus Rivera all along. From the very beginning, his grief seemed performative, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Too controlled, too neat. Real grief is messy, you know? But he was back to maintaining his lawn within a week, hosting barbecues within a month. It never felt authentic. In the defendant's chair, Marcus stared at his hands. His court-appointed attorney, David Kim, had warned him that Karen would be the prosecution's star witness, that her recording and testimony would likely seal his conviction. What Kim hadn't prepared him for was how it would feel to have his grief dissected by someone who'd never lost a child, judged by someone who knew nothing about the weight of carrying such a terrible secret. Did you ever express your concerns to anyone? Valdez continued. I tried, Karen said, and Marcus could hear the satisfaction creeping into her voice. I mentioned to several neighbors that something felt off. I even called the police tip line twice, but they said the case was closed. No one wanted to listen. That was a lie, and they both knew it. Karen had never called any tip line. Marcus would have known if Internal Affairs had been sniffing around earlier. But lies told under oath with convictions sounded like truth too. A jury, and Karen Whitmore was nothing if not convincing. What changed your mind about calling 911 on the morning of May 15th? Valdez asked. Karen's eyes sparkled. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the crescendo of her starring role in this tragedy. Initially, I called about the noise violation. He was destroying his pool at 5 in the morning, disturbing the entire neighborhood. But when that internal affairs detective arrived and started asking questions, double quotes, she paused for effect, letting the tension build. I realized this was bigger than just a property dispute. My civic duty compelled me to document everything I could. Marcus's lawyer leaned over and whispered, she's good. Jury's eating it up, and they were. 12 faces in the jury box, all hanging on Karen's every word, all seeing her as the heroic neighbor who'd refused to let a killer hide in plain sight. They didn't see what Marcus saw, the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. The way she preened under the attention, the careful way she'd constructed herself as the moral center of this story. Mrs. Whitmore Valdez held up her phone, now entered. As evidence, this recording you made, were you aware of its potential significance when you started recording? Not initially, Karen said, managing to sound both humble and heroic. I thought I was just documenting a property dispute for potential HOA action. But when I heard him confess to murdering that poor little boy, she shook her head, as if the memory still overwhelmed her. I knew I had to preserve every word. The confession played again for the jury, Marcus's voice filling the courtroom with his damning words. I lost my son in this pool 3 years ago. I held him under until he stopped moving. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Several jurors shifted, uncomfortably. One woman, a mother, based on the family photo she'd shown during Vor. Dyer wiped her eyes with a tissue. Marcus felt their revulsion like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. When the recording ended, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Da Valdez let the moment stretch, let the horror sink in, before continuing. Mrs. Whitmore, in your opinion, would the defendant's confession have come to light without your intervention? Defense attorney Kim stood up. Objection calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Martinez ruled, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the question, had drawn the obvious conclusion. Karen Whitmore was the hero of this story, the citizen, who'd done what law enforcement couldn't. No further questions, Da Valdez said. Returning to her table with the confidence of someone who'd just secured a conviction, David Kim approached the witness stand like a man walking to his own execution. The defense had almost nothing to work with. Marcus had confessed on tape, had provided details that only the killer could know, had shown the investigators exactly where Daniel's body had been submerged. Kim's only strategy was to chip away at Karen's credibility, but that was like trying to stop a tsunami with a paper towel. Mrs. Whitmore, Kim began, you testified that you called the police tip line twice about your suspicions regarding Mr. Rivera. Do you have any documentation of these calls? Karen's composure flickered for just a moment. Documentation, phone records, case numbers, names of the officers you spoke with. Well, no. But so we only have your word that these calls were made. Da Valdez stood up. Objection. Relevance. Goes to credibility. Your Honor, Kim replied. I'll allow it, but get to your point, Counselor. Kim nodded. Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it true that your relationship with my client has been contentious from the day he moved into the neighborhood? Karen's jaw tightened. I wouldn't say contentious. You filed 17 HOA complaints against him in 3 years. You called the city about his landscaping choices 6 times. You threatened to sue him over his fence height. Kim consulted his notes. Would you describe these as the actions of a concerned neighbor, or someone with a personal vendetta? I was protecting property values, Karen said, her voice rising. When someone moves into a neighborhood like ours, there are certain standards. Standards based on what, Mrs. Whitmore? The color of his skin? His profession? The fact that he didn't fit your vision of who belonged in your community. Objection. Da Valdez was on her feet. Inflammatory and prejudicial. Sustained. The jury will disregard. But Kim had planted the seed, and Marcus could see it taking root in a few jurors' minds. The idea that Karen's motivation might not be as pure as she claimed, that her version of events might be colored by bias and personal animosity. Mrs. Whitmore, Kim continued, you testified that my client's grief seemed performative. Are you a licensed psychologist? No. But a grief counselor? A mental health professional of any kind? No. So your assessment of Mr. Rivera's emotional state was based on ... What exactly? Your extensive training in human psychology. Your professional experience with trauma victims. Karen's face was flushing red. I'm an observant person. I know when something doesn't look right. Or maybe, Kim said quietly, you saw what you wanted to see. A man you'd been trying to drive out of the neighborhood for 3 years. Finally, giving you the ammunition you needed. That's not I would never, Karen sputtered, her composure finally cracking. You recorded Mr. Rivera's confession because you thought it would help with your noise complaint, didn't you? You had no idea about the child's death until Detective Chen arrived. I was concerned about property violations, so when you called 911, you weren't reporting a suspected child killer, you were reporting a noise violation. The murder confession was just a happy accident. Da Valdez objected again, but the damage was done. Kim had stripped away Karen's heroic narrative, revealing her for what she really was, a petty neighbor who'd stumbled into significance through spite and luck. But as Kim returned to his table, Marcus knew it wouldn't be enough. The jury might question Karen's motives, but they couldn't question the recording, his voice, his words, his confession. The truth was still the truth, no matter how it came to light. The trial continued for 2 more days, a parade of expert witnesses and character testimony that felt like watching his life being dissected in slow motion. Sophia testified about their marriage, about the custody dispute, about Marcus's increasing instability in the months before Daniel's death. Tony took the stand and destroyed what remained of his own career by admitting he'd helped destroy evidence. However, unwittingly, Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the forensic psychologist, explained to the jury how a parent could kill their own child, the twisted logic of possession and control, the inability to distinguish between love and ownership. Her testimony was clinical, professional, devastating. Through it all, Karen sat in the gallery's front row, soaking up every moment of attention. Reporters interviewed her during breaks, asking about her heroism, her keen observations, her civic-minded courage. She'd hired a publicist, Marcus learned, and was already fielding offers for book deals and true crime documentaries. She'd found her calling as the neighbor who'd brought a killer to justice, and she was going to milk it for everything it was worth. On the final day of testimony, Marcus took the stand in his own defense against his lawyer's advice, but with the desperate hope that somehow, if he could just explain, if he could make them understand the weight of that moment 3 years ago. Mr. Rivera de Valdez began her 6 months after Marcus Rivera's conviction, Karen Whitmore stood in her perfectly manicured backyard, staring at the empty lot where his house used to be. The demolition had been completed 2 weeks ago. The new owners wanted a fresh start, a clean slate unmarked by tragedy. All that remained was a rectangle of bare earth and the concrete pad where the pool had been, the pool that had started everything. Karen wrapped her silk robe tighter against the morning chill and sipped her coffee, trying to recapture the satisfaction she'd felt during those first heady weeks after the trial. The interviews, the book deal, the true crime documentary that had made her a minor celebrity. The neighbor who knew Karen Whitmore's fight for justice had spent 3 weeks on the bestseller list, and the Netflix series based on her story was already in She should have been triumphant. She'd gotten everything she'd ever wanted. Marcus was serving life without parole. Property values had stabilized after the demolition, and she was finally being recognized for her intelligence and civic virtue. So why did she feel so empty? The first crack in her perfect narrative had appeared during the book tour. A journalist in Phoenix, some millennial with nose piercings and an attitude, had asked an uncomfortable question. Mrs. Whitmore, don't you think it's problematic that you profited from a child's death? Karen had given her standard response about justice and civic duty, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Other interviews followed with similar questions. Was she exploiting a tragedy? Had she really been investigating Marcus? Or just harassing a grieving neighbor? Why had it taken 3 years for her suspicions to surface? The social media backlash had started slowly, then built into a roar. Hashtag Karen Whitmore began trending, but not in the way she'd hoped. People dissected her interviews, analyzed her motivations, questioned her heroic narrative. The worst part was how accurately some of them had read her the bored suburban housewife, who'd found purpose in other people's misery, the racist who had hidden her prejudice behind property values and civic concerns. Karen, her husband Robert's voice came from the kitchen doorway. There's someone here to see you. She turned, annoyed at the interruption. Ever since her newfound fame, people had been showing up at odd hours: reporters, fans, curiosity seekers, and increasingly, critics who wanted to confront her face to face. Robert had started screening visitors, but his judgment wasn't always reliable. Who is it? Detective Chen, from Internal Affairs? Karen's blood turned to ice water. Detective Sandra Chen had testified at Marcus's trial, but they'd barely interacted since then. What could she possibly want now? Send her back, Karen said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Detective Chen appeared a few minutes later, looking as sharp and intimidating as ever in her charcoal suit, but there was something different about her demeanor, less professional courtesy, more predatory focus. Mrs. Whitmore, Chen said, settling into the patio chair across from Karen without being invited. Beautiful morning, Detective. This is ... unexpected. Is there something I can help you with? Chen pulled out her ever-present tablet, swiped through several screens. I've been reviewing some old files. Following up on loose ends from the Rivera case. Karen felt her chest tighten, but kept her expression neutral. I thought that case was closed. The murder case is closed. Yes. Marcus Rivera is exactly where he belongs. Chen looked up from her tablet, and her eyes were cold as winter fog. But there are other aspects of the case that have been troubling me, such as your insurance claim. For instance, the words hit Karen like a physical blow. She managed to keep her coffee cup steady, but just barely. I'm sorry. Homeowners. Insurance claim. Filed 3 days after Rivera's arrest. Water damage to your basement, caused by a burst pipe during the pool demolition. Chen consulted her tablet. Payout of $47,000. Karen's mind raced. How had Chen found out about the insurance claim? And more importantly, what did she think she knew? I don't see how that's relevant to anything, Karen said carefully. Neither did I, initially. But then I got curious about the timing. See, burst pipes usually happen in winter, when temperatures drop, but this was May, 70-degree weather. Chen swiped to another screen. So I had a chat with your plumber. Interesting guy, very talkative. The patio seemed to tilt around. Karen Eddie Morales, the plumber she'd hired to fix the burst pipe, had been very understanding about the unusual circumstances, very accommodating about the paperwork, very willing to overlook certain ... irregularities, in exchange for a generous cash bonus. I'm not sure what you're implying, Karen said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. I'm not implying anything, I'm stating facts. Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You flooded your own basement? Karen turned on every faucet, opened every valve, let the water run for hours while you were at Rivera's trial. Then you filed a fraudulent insurance claim and split the payout with your plumber. The accusation hung in the morning air like a toxic cloud. Karen felt the walls of her perfect life crumbling around her, just as Marcus's had 6 months ago. The irony was exquisite. She'd brought down a killer through her nosiness and spite, only to be brought down herself by a detective's thorough investigation. You can't prove any of that, Karen said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were false. Chen wouldn't be here without proof. Security cameras are everywhere these days, Chen said conversationally. Your neighbor across the street has a doorbell cam that shows you entering and leaving your house during the trial. The timestamps are very interesting. You left for court at 8 a.m., came home at lunch for exactly 27 minutes, then returned to court just long enough to turn on the water and open the basement valves. Karen's hands were shaking now, her coffee cup rattling against the saucer. She set it down and tried to think, but her mind felt like it was wrapped in cotton. This couldn't be happening, not to her, not after everything she'd accomplished. Why? Chen asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. You were already famous. The book was selling. Why risk everything for $47,000? Karen stared at the empty lot where Marcus's house had been, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to answer. Why had she done it? The money? Yes, but it was more than that. It was the thrill of getting away with something, the intoxicating sense of being smarter than everyone else, the addictive rush of manipulating a system that had finally started paying attention to her. Because I could, she said finally. Because after 30 years of being invisible, of being just another suburban housewife, I finally mattered. People listened to me, respected me, and I thought I was untouchable. Chen nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. The same reason Rivera killed his son. Really? Not the surface reason, the custody dispute, the anger, the momentary loss of control, the real reason underneath all that. Because he could. Because in that moment he had absolute power over another human being, and he used it. The comparison hit Karen like a slap. I'm nothing like him. I caught a killer. I brought justice. You stumbled into justice by accident, Chen corrected. Your motivation was spite, not heroism. You wanted Rivera gone from your neighborhood, and you got lucky that he turned out to be a murderer. If he'd been innocent, you would have kept harassing him anyway. Karen wanted to protest, to defend herself, to maintain the narrative she'd constructed so carefully, but the words died in her throat, because Chen was right. If Marcus had been just a grieving father instead of a killer, Karen would have kept filing complaints and making his life miserable until he moved away or broke under the pressure. The fact that he'd actually been guilty was just cosmic justice, not her keen detective work. What happens now? Karen asked. Chen stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her suit. Now you get to experience the criminal justice system from the other side. Insurance fraud is a felony in California. With the amount involved, you're looking at 2 to 5 years. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. Detective, please. I made a mistake, but you made a choice, Chen said firmly. Just like Rivera did, just like everyone does when they decide their wants matter more than other people's rights. She paused at the gate, looking back. The funny thing is, if you'd just been content with your fame, with your book deal, and your documentary, you probably would have gotten away with it. No one was looking that closely at your finances. Then why? Because you got greedy? Because you couldn't resist one more score, one more manipulation, one more chance to prove how clever you were. Chun's smile was sharp as a blade. Sound familiar? After Chun left, Karen sat alone in her backyard, staring at the concrete pad, where Marcus Rivera's pool had been, the pool that had been Daniel Rivera's grave, and Marcus's downfall, and ultimately her own undoing. She thought about Marcus in his prison cell, probably reading about her arrest in the morning paper, probably smiling at the irony. The woman who'd brought him down had fallen into the same trap, the belief that being right about one thing made you invincible about everything else. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from her publisher. Need to talk. Urgent. Another from her agent. Call me ASAP. A third from the Netflix producer. Legal concerns about the series. Ken.